Welcome, my beloved student. How you doing? Hope you all are doing great and lovely. In this video, we are going to see what if Deku was born with 3 Odyssey curse quirks. This is part 1, and for more amazing content, leave a like, share, and subscribe. And I want to thank the author of this story named S Beyond Limits, Izuku's Cursed Odyssey by HisKingIsDone. So do check out both of them and leave kudos. Let's get in the video. No one can pinpoint precisely when it began, but speculation places the genesis nearly 2 centuries ago. On that fateful day, the world was stunned by news of the birth of a mysterious, luminous infant in a bustling Chinese city. The report spread like wildfire, drawing scientists and researchers from every corner of the globe to investigate this inexplicable phenomenon. Samples taken from the child revealed a peculiar strand of DNA embedded within its cellular structure. Further study confirmed that this unique genetic code was the source of the astonishing occurrence. Soon thereafter, reports of people displaying bizarre abilities began to surface worldwide. Some could conjure blocks of ice to shield themselves. Others could move objects with their minds, and still others exhibited powers even stranger. Scientists quickly identified the same unique DNA strand in each of these individuals, linking it to the emergence of these extraordinary capabilities. As time wore on, the extraordinary became commonplace, and these new abilities were coined with a simple, definitive term: quirks. However, the emergence of quirks ushered in a new era of possibilities. Dreams materialized into reality, and what was once relegated to the realm of fantasy became an everyday occurrence. Celebrated on screens, these abilities now breathed life into reality. With the proliferation of quirks, the order and law enforced by the world's governments began to crumble. Criminals, newly empowered, were reclassified as villains. The balance of power shifted, and the world teetered on the brink of chaos. To counter the rising threat, governments worldwide united to form a formidable organization, a group tasked with combating the influx of villains and restoring order. This elite force would stand as a beacon of justice, delivering retribution to the wronged and upholding the fragile peace. They would be known simply as heroes. Among these heroes emerged individuals who epitomized the very essence of heroism. But none shone brighter than the man who would become the symbol of peace. His name was All Might. However, this is not his tale. This is the story of Izuku Midoriya, the boy destined to become the greatest hero of them all. "Don't do this, Kakin," a green-haired boy pleaded, his voice shaking as he stood protectively in front of another boy. "What the hell, Deku?" a spiky blonde-haired boy snarled, fury evident in his eyes. "Get out of my way." I can't do that, Kakin," the green-haired boy stammered, his legs trembling but his stance resolute. "I can't let you bully him like that." "Oi, Deku, are you really gonna take a beating for him?" one of Bakugo's lackeys sneered, his lips curled in a smug grin. "Why, yes," the green-haired boy replied, glancing nervously around the deserted park, his heart pounding in his chest. "Because that's what a hero would do," Bakugo growled, his eyes narrowing as small sparks began to dance on his hands. "Oi, you shitty nerd. You still going on about being a hero?" Deku gulped, fear constricting his throat, but he held his ground. "Yes, I want to be a hero." Bakugo threw his head back and laughed mockingly. "As if a quirkless nobody like you would ever become a hero." He then glanced past Deku and smirked. "Look behind you, Deku. That boy you wanted to save has already run away." Izuku turned to see that the boy had indeed fled. He looked back at Bakugo, who was now wearing a menacing smirk. "Maybe you need a little reminder of your place, shitty Deku?" Bakugo spat, small explosions detonating in his palms. The green-haired boy closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable onslaught. This was not new to him. This was a day-to-day occurrence in his life now. He had tried to tell the teachers, but they could care less. Every time Bakugo and his lackeys tormented him, the teachers would turn a blind eye, as if Izuku's suffering didn't concern them, as if he was not their responsibility. If the teachers did nothing, what could he expect in an empty park? He knew no one was coming to save him. No hero, no teacher, no adult. Just like every other time, he would go home battered and bruised, pretending he had fallen or tripped to avoid worrying his mother. And so, the green-haired little boy waited, eyes shut tight, for the searing pain of Bakugo's explosions. He waited, and waited, and waited a little more, but nothing happened. Izuku felt no pain. Had he become so accustomed to suffering that he no longer registered it? It wouldn't be surprising, given the countless mini-explosions he'd endured. What the hell, DEKU? Izuku flinched at Bakugo's sudden outburst, his eyes snapping open to meet the blonde's fiery gaze. Why the hell can't I touch you? Bakugo bellowed, his palm crackling with uncontrolled energy. What? Izuku stammered, barely above a whisper. Bakugo gritted his teeth, the explosions in his hands growing more violent. He lunged at Izuku, his palm mere inches from the younger boy's face. But Izuku was rooted to the spot, frozen in fear. This was the first time Bakugo had aimed for his head. Was Bakugo really trying to kill him? Time seemed to slow for Izuku. As Bakugo's hand drew closer, Izuku could see the energy around it. A volatile, crackling force ready to explode. Suddenly, his awareness expanded. In that fleeting moment, he became acutely aware of every detail in the park. The bird perched on a distant branch, the swing swaying gently in the breeze. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew that if he didn't act, Bakugo would leave him forever scarred. With every fiber of his being, Izuku wished for something, anything to protect him. And his wish was granted. As Bakugo's hand neared Izuku's face, he let out an explosion powerful enough to shatter a rock. But to everyone's disbelief, the blast halted mere inches from Izuku's face, splitting in two directions as if striking an invisible barrier. Izuku stared in astonishment while Bakugo and his lackeys gaped in shock. It was as if some unseen force had erected an impenetrable shield before Izuku's face. Bakugo's face contorted into a vicious snarl. "What the hell, DEKU?" he roared. "Just stand down and take the beating, you bastard." He released another explosion, this time aimed squarely at Izuku's chest, but found he couldn't get close enough. The explosion detonated harmlessly, unable to reach its target. Just then, Izuku sensed a presence entering his perception. He could feel that the figure was male with strange particles in his eyes, which looked dry and devoid of sleep. While Izuku struggled to comprehend how he sensed the man's presence, Bakugo continued his desperate attempts to lay hands on him. Realizing his explosions were futile, Bakugo unleashed an animalistic roar and threw a punch aimed at Izuku's chest. But his eyes widened in shock as his fist halted mere inches from Izuku's body. He strained to move it further, but his hand refused to budge. The most baffling part was that he didn't feel any barrier. It was as if his hand simply could not touch Izuku. His fist hung suspended in midair, powerless. Bakugo gritted his teeth, his gaze shifting upward to meet Izuku's eyes. For the third time that day, his eyes widened in shock. The green eyes that usually held fear and uncertainty now stared back at him with an unfamiliar intensity. The eyes that Bakugo had grown accustomed to seeing filled with subservience and dread now burned with a strange new resolve. Instead, a pair of eyes like emeralds stared back at him, shining, fiery, and unlike anything Bakugo had ever seen from Izuku. These eyes held an intensity that unnerved him, a glint that seemed to pierce through him, judging his very soul. Something was wrong with Izuku's eyes, and Bakugo didn't like it one bit. "Hey, what are you kids doing?" A deep, authoritative voice called out from the entrance of the park. The strange force field seemed to dissipate, and Bakugo immediately jerked his hand back, turning on his heels to flee in the opposite direction. He wanted no part of whoever had spoken. There were more pressing matters to address. Izuku glanced toward the park's entrance. A man with dark hair and bandages haphazardly wrapped around his shoulder was approaching him. As if the last of his energy had been sapped, Izuku's eyes fluttered shut, and he tumbled backward. Instead of hitting the hard ground, he felt something comforting, something warm envelop him. He instinctively nuzzled closer to the warmth, allowing himself to drift into unconsciousness. As Izuku lay there, his mind wandered to a distant memory, one he had long forgotten. Flashback. Izuku Midoriya was a bright and spirited 4-year-old boy, his eyes glowing with an eager, infectious enthusiasm. His dark green hair and vibrant green eyes danced with a light that seemed to outshine the sun itself. Izuku's dream was singular and passionate, to become a hero. He currently sat in the doctor's office, his mother, Inko Midoriya, perched anxiously beside him. Inko was beautiful, her green hair cascading down her shoulders, her figure a testament to the envy of many women her age. However, her usual radiance was overshadowed by a creeping sense of apprehension, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Izuku, oblivious to his mother's tension, bounced excitedly in his seat. Today was his 4th birthday, the age at which most children's quirks manifested. Inko had brought him to the hospital for a checkup, hoping to discover the nature of his quirk. "Mom, do you think I'll have an awesome quirk?" Izuku asked, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. Inko managed a strained smile, one that Izuku, in his excitement, failed to notice. "Of course, honey. I'm sure you'll be amazing," she replied, the hollowness in her words palpable. Izuku's exuberance only grew as he continued to fidget in his chair, unaware of the heaviness settling in his mother's heart. Suddenly, the door to the office swung open, and the doctor entered, his face etched with a grim expression. Inko's worry deepened as she watched the doctor take his seat, carefully avoiding their gaze. "Doctor, is everything all right?" Inko asked, her voice laced with concern. "Hey, doctor, can you tell me what my quirk is?" Izuku interjected, his voice bursting with hope and excitement. "Is it something amazing like All Might's?" The doctor frowned, rubbing his forehead as if to ward off an impending headache. "I don't know what to say," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the stack of papers before him. The office fell silent, the weight of the doctor's words hanging heavily in the air. Izuku's smile faltered slightly as the doctor paused. Even though he was a child, he could sense the hesitation in the doctor's voice. The doctor sighed and continued, "I mean, young Midoriya here has every indication of possessing a quirk, but for some reason it has yet to activate as it normally should." Izuku's smile vanished completely this time. But..." He tried to argue, but words failed him. "Doctor, does that mean he can still awaken his quirk?" Inko pleaded, desperation seeping into her voice. I mean, everyone his age has already awakened their quirks." The doctor nodded. "Well, he should be able to awaken his quirk. You see, most people with quirks have only one joint in their pinky toe." He pulled out an X-ray sheet and displayed it to them. "Your son also possesses this trait, which should mean that he has a quirk." So we proceeded with a quick check on his genes, and we found the necessary genetic material for a quirk. From the looks of it, his quirk is still dormant. It wouldn't be the first time something like this has happened. Maybe his quirk needs some form of trigger to awaken. Izuku stared at the doctor, wide-eyed, his body trembling. Does that mean I can still be a hero?" he managed to ask, his voice shaking. "Yes, kid," the doctor replied with a comforting smile. "You just need to wait for your quirk to awaken." Izuku could no longer hold back his emotions, and tears began to stream down his cheeks. The doctor's words carried a mix of hope and heartache, a vague promise amidst a crushing reality. Inko, sensing her son's turmoil, pulled him close, offering what little comfort she could in the face of such uncertain news. She nodded gratefully at the doctor, gathered Izuku in her arms, and left the room, his small hands gripping her blouse tightly. As the mother-son duo reached home, Inko gently set Izuku down. She hated seeing him so dejected. It had been a long time since she'd seen him this disappointed. "Izuku dear, why don't you go and wash yourself? I'll prepare your favorite dish for dinner," she said softly. Izuku didn't respond, merely nodding as he shuffled towards the bathroom. Dinner was a quiet affair. Inko's heart shattered further as she watched Izuku eat mechanically, like a robot. She had prepared his favorite dish, something that usually cheered him up, but today even that seemed to fall short. After finishing his meal, Izuku quietly placed his dishes in the sink, like he always did. He murmured a good night to his mother and trudged towards his room. Inko washed the dishes, her mind heavy with worry. As she was about to retire to her own room, she heard muffled sounds coming from Izuku's room. She walked towards his door, opening it as gently as she could. The sight that greeted her filled her eyes with tears. Izuku was sitting in front of his computer watching videos of All Might. He turned slowly, likely having noticed her through the monitor's reflection. Mom, see, can I be a hero? Izuku asked, his voice trembling. See, can I be like All Might? Inko tried to hold back her tears. She wanted to tell Izuku that he could be a hero, a great hero. But she also knew the life of a hero, the dangers and sacrifices it entailed. As a mother, she could never willingly send her child into such peril. So, she did the only thing she could. She rushed to her son and enveloped him in a tight embrace, letting her tears flow freely. Yes, yes, Izuku, you can. You can be a hero, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Flashback end. Izuku's eyes flickered open, immediately squeezing shut against the harsh glare of the sun. He raised a trembling arm to shield his face and pushed himself upright with the other, sitting up slowly. Confusion clouded his mind as he surveyed his surroundings. He found himself sprawled on a park bench, the early morning light casting long, dancing shadows across the dew-kissed grass. Ah, seems like you're finally awake. Took you long enough. The dry voice cut through Izuku's haze, snapping him to full alertness. He turned to find a man sitting at the foot of the bench, nonchalantly sipping from a juice box. The man's long, black shaggy hair framed a stern face marked by red-rimmed eyes and dark circles, signs of prolonged sleeplessness. Bandages were loosely wrapped around his neck, and he wore dark, utilitarian clothes. Izuku flinched as the man turned his head, meeting his gaze with an unsettling intensity. My name is Shoyuta Aizawa. The man's voice was devoid of any emotion, his introduction delivered with an air of indifference. Care to tell me what was going on back there? Izuku shifted uneasily on the bench. Thanks for looking after me, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. And I don't know what you're talking about. He averted his gaze, feeling the weight of Aizawa's scrutiny. The man's eyes bore into him, as if dissecting every fiber of his being. You know, I am a hero, Aizawa stated, his tone unchanged. You shouldn't be lying to me. You're a hero, Izuku asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I have never heard of you, Aizawa shrugged dismissively. Understandable. I never really cared for publicity. Whoa. Izuku stammered, at a loss for words. Now, are you going to tell me what was going on? Aizawa pressed, his gaze unyielding. Izuku hesitated, his fingers knotting together nervously. Kaken and IW were just playing, he finished, avoiding Aizawa's penetrating stare. Aizawa's eyes narrowed, his expression skeptical. He had witnessed a brief interaction between Izuku and the blonde boy, and it was clear to him that their exchange was far from playful. Despite his desire to help, he knew there was little he could do if the boy refused to confide in him. Aizawa released a weary sigh, his eyes sweeping over Izuku's small, trembling frame. All right, let's bring you home, he said, standing up. Izuku nodded and jumped off the bench, aligning himself beside Aizawa as they walked toward his home. The sun bathed the path in a warm, golden light, casting long shadows that danced around their feet. While they walked, Aizawa glanced at the boy from the corner of his eye. He had noticed Izuku's use of his quirk back in the park. From his keen observation, it seemed like some sort of barrier quirk, rare and intriguing. Aizawa had a sense that there was more to Izuku's quirk than met the eye, a hidden potential lurking beneath the surface of apparent simplicity. He noticed Izuku fidgeting, a nervous energy radiating from the boy. Aizawa knew the signs all too well. The kid wanted to ask questions but lacked the courage to do so. You want to ask something? Aizawa stated in a bored tone, his eyes fixed ahead. Go on then. Izuku hesitated, his voice small and uncertain. You said you were a hero, right? What is your hero name? I don't think you'll know about me, but I go by the name Eraserhead. Izuku's eyes widened with astonishment. his face lighting up like a Christmas tree. "Wait, you are Eraserhead?" he cried out, his voice filled with awe and fascination. Aizawa looked at the boy, surprised by his reaction. "You know me, kid?" "Of course, I know you," Izuku replied, his enthusiasm barely contained. "You're the underground hero Eraserhead, the hero who works in the dark and has owned the shadows like no one else. You're like Batman just without the money." Aizawa raised an eyebrow, impressed. For a boy who appeared no older than 5 to know about underground heroes was something else. "Impressive. You must be a fanboy then." Izuku laughed sheepishly. "Yeah, I like to learn about heroes." "You must be aiming to be a hero then?" Aizawa asked, glancing at Izuku from the corner of his eyes. Izuku's enthusiastic smile faded into a melancholic one. "Yeah, I do want to become a hero, but I don't know how I can be a hero without a quirk." Aizawa blinked, taken aback. "What are you talking about? Didn't you use your quirk back there at the park?" Izuku's eyes widened slowly in realization. "Oh my god, I completely forgot about that," he cried out, holding his head with his hands. Aizawa released a tired sigh. "You do realize that using your quirk in public is strictly prohibited by the law." I know," Izuku stuttered. But I did not have a quirk before today." Aizawa stared at the boy beside him, his brows furrowing slightly. "How old are you?" 5, Izuku replied, his voice barely audible. Aizawa raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Interesting. So, you awakened your quirk today?"
Yeah.
"I see. A late bloomer then, huh?" Soon, they found themselves standing in front of an apartment complex. Aizawa noted that the neighborhood was surprisingly calm and pleasant, a stark contrast to the rougher parts of the city he was accustomed to. "Maybe I can find an apartment here," he mused to himself. Izuku led the way up to the 3rd floor and stopped in front of a well-maintained door. He knocked softly, and a few moments later, a woman in her late 20s opened it. She had the same green hair as Izuku, though hers was straighter and more elegantly styled. Aizawa found her exceptionally beautiful, but he kept his thoughts to himself. "Izuku, you're home," the woman said with a warm smile, her eyes moving to Aizawa as her smile never faded. "And you've brought a guest." "Yeah. Mom, this is the underground hero I was talking about that day. He's Eraserhead," Izuku exclaimed, pointing excitedly at Aizawa. "Izuku, pointing fingers at others is bad manners," the woman gently scolded, her voice firm yet kind. She turned her attention to Aizawa. "How can I help you, Mr. Eraserhead?" Aizawa shook his head, maintaining his monotone. No, it's all right. I found him unconscious in the park and looked after him." Inko's smile faded, replaced by concern. "Unconscious?" She looked down at her son, worry etched on her face. "What happened, Aizachan?" Izuku averted his gaze, shifting uncomfortably. I just fell unconscious, and Mr. Eraserhead found me." Inko's expression softened with gratitude as she turned back to Aizawa. "Thank you, Mr. Eraserhead. I am extremely grateful." Aizawa observed Izuku, noticing how his earlier vibrant energy had diminished, replaced by a nervous, fidgeting demeanor. The boy seemed to be avoiding the subject, even in front of his mother. Aizawa turned his gaze towards Inko, who was still smiling warmly at her son. "It would seem that your son has awakened his quirk today," Aizawa said, deciding to alleviate the boy's discomfort. Yeah. "Mom, I finally awakened my quirk," Izuku exclaimed, his spirit momentarily reignited. "That's great, Izuku-chan. Why don't you go inside and wash your hands? We'll go to the doctor after we eat lunch," Inko suggested, her voice filled with a mix of relief and excitement. "Okay." Izuku dashed inside, leaving Aizawa and Inko alone. "Quite the hyperactive child you have there," Aizawa commented, eliciting a knowing smile from Inko. "I can't deny that. He's always been quite active and cheerful," she replied, her smile fading as she turned serious. "Now, Mr. Eraserhead, if you don't mind me asking, can you please tell me everything that happened?" Aizawa hesitated, contemplating whether to reveal the day's events. He knew Izuku was avoiding the topic, but he was also curious as to why. Inko sighed, her expression melancholic. For the past year, I've noticed something odd about Izuku. Every day he comes home with dirty clothes. When I ask, he says he fell while playing. Sometimes he comes home with bruises. No matter how many times I ask, he just avoids answering. She confessed, her voice laden with worry. So, bullying, huh? Aizawa mused to himself. He nodded absently and asked, Do you know someone named Kaken? Inko looked taken aback. Kaken? You mean Katsuki? Why? So, you do know him. Can you tell me where his house is? Inko hesitated, her brow furrowing in confusion. Yes, I do know where his house is. But why do you want to know that? Aizawa stared at her blankly for a few seconds before confessing. I saw him using his quirk on your son in the park. Inko's eyes widened in shock. Are you serious? Why, you didn't misunderstand, did you? Aizawa shook his head. I heard it quite clearly, but your shock is worrying. Katsuki, Inko uttered, a mixture of disbelief and pain in her voice. He is my best friend's son. I thought he and my son were best friends. Well, shit. Aizawa cursed silently. I may have just stepped into a very dangerous situation. He thought before saying, something must have happened between them. Something that only your son can explain. I can't believe it. Inko's eyes widened, her mouth agape with shock. Why would he do something like that? I am curious to know that too, Aizawa said softly, his voice laced with a degree of concern. Now, if you could tell me about his address. Inko hesitated, her gaze drifting downward as if searching for answers in the patterns of the floor. Well, he lives down the street, in a yellow house. House number 53. Thanks. I'll leave you alone, Aizawa replied, maintaining a calm demeanor despite the volatility of the situation. Inko looked up sharply, worry furrowing her brow. What are you going to do? Aizawa turned to her, his expression thoughtful. This situation can be tricky. If it were an adult, he would be arrested for using his quirk in public. But we're dealing with a child and a bullying case. At best, he will be sent to rehab until he fixes his behavior, and at worst, he will be barred from becoming a hero. Especially with all the reforms that are taking place in the hero society. Inko nodded, a look of understanding and gratitude crossing her features. Have a good day, Mrs. Midoriya, Aizawa said, turning away. You too, Mr. Eraserhead, she replied, her voice tinged with a mixture of relief and concern as she watched the hero walk away. 3 days later, Izuku sat in his classroom, a wide, irrepressible grin plastered across his face. It had been there since the moment he woke up, and it refused to fade. Today was a day unlike any other in Izuku's life, the day he would finally learn the nature of his quirk. The anticipation gnawed at him, a mix of excitement and anxiety churning in his stomach. After lunch, Izuku and his mother found themselves back in the same doctor's office they had visited a year ago. The doctor led Izuku to a testing lab where a team of physicians conducted a series of exhaustive tests. By the end of the day, however, no conclusive result had been reached. Usually, quirk results were declared almost immediately, and in rare cases within a day. But for some inexplicable reason, Izuku's quirk eluded the doctors. They were summoned back the next day for more tests and the day after that. Finally, the doctors promised that Izuku's quirk would be revealed the following day. The school bell rang, signaling the end of the day. Students began packing their bags, their chatter filling the air. Izuku hurriedly stuffed his books into his bag, his heart pounding with anticipation. Just as he was about to rush out of the classroom, Bakugo stepped in front of him, blocking his path. So, DEKU, have you found out what your quirk is yet? Bakugo asked, his voice laced with mockery. Izuku shifted nervously, his eyes flicking away from Bakugo's penetrating gaze. Not yet, Kaken. But the doctor said I would get the results today. Bakugo sneered, a cruel laugh escaping his lips. Did you hear that, guys? DEKU will get his quirk today, after 3 days. Looks like your quirk is so pathetic that even the doctors don't want to tell you what it is. One of Bakugo's lackeys chimed in, a harsh laugh echoing through the room. As if Deku would ever have a useful quirk. That's not nice, Kakin? Izuku stammered, his voice barely audible. Bakugo's eyes narrowed, a menacing growl edging his words. Oh yeah? You're the one who snitched on me, you dumbass. Do you know how humiliated I was when a fucking pro hero came to my house and told my parents I was bullying you? Izuku's eyes widened in shock. But I didn't say anything. You have to believe me. Believe you? Bakugo scoffed. As if I would believe a liar like you, you bastard. I'm not lying. Izuku insisted, his voice rising with desperation. Bakugo sneered, his voice dripping with venom. Whatever. I'm out of here. Not that spending time with you will do me any good. He paused, his gaze hardening. Because of you, I have to attend rehab and disciplinary classes. Fuck. I want to kill you. Izuku flinched, the words cutting deep. Bakugo's lackeys laughed harder, their cruel laughter echoing through the room. Bakugo snorted and waved a dismissive hand. I'll tell you this, Deku. You'll never be a hero. With that, he turned and strode out of the room, his lackeys trailing behind him. Izuku stood frozen, tears welling up in his eyes. The students around him looked at him with pity, but none of them said a word. Izuku sniffed and wiped his eyes furiously. No, I won't cry today. Today is the big day. Izuku thought to himself as he dashed out of the classroom, heading straight for the school's main gate. There, his mother stood waiting for him. Inko smiled warmly, opening the car door to let him in. They drove to the hospital in silence, the weight of anticipation heavy in the air. A few minutes later, they found themselves sitting in the doctor's office. The doctor entered, looking harried as he laid the files back on the table. He pulled out a handkerchief and wiped his forehead. Doctor. About the quirk. Inko trailed off as the doctor let out a nervous chuckle. I must say, Miss Midoriya, young Izuku here is truly a once-in-a-generation case, the doctor said, his nerves evident. What do you mean, doctor? Inko asked, hope shining in her eyes. The doctor sighed, shuffling through the documents. I'll be honest with you. Last year, when you came for the quirk identification and Izuku's quirk did not awaken, I assumed that his quirk was too weak to show up. Izuku felt a pang of dread. Does that mean my quirk is weak? He asked nervously, fearing that Bakugo might have been right after all. The doctor chuckled. Weak? If Izuku's quirk is weak, then every other quirk is just useless. What do you mean, doctor? Inko's brows furrowed in confusion. The easiest way to explain Izuku's quirk is that he is a living, walking mathematical and scientific paradox, the doctor said, wiping his forehead again. That's supposed to be easy to understand? Inko deadpanned, shooting the doctor a skeptical look. The doctor laughed awkwardly. I'm quite sure you've heard of the Zeno paradox, also known as the Achilles paradox? No, sir, Inko replied, shaking her head. Well, it's one of the 4 paradoxes posed by the Greek philosopher Zeno thousands of years ago, the doctor explained, leaning forward in his chair. It concerns a race between the fleet-footed Achilles, a Greek demigod, and a slow-moving tortoise. In this race, the tortoise is given a few meters head start, and then both begin moving at the same time. But the condition is that Achilles will always have to travel a distance equal to the distance the tortoise has covered. The argument is that, no matter how fast Achilles moves, he will never be able to overtake the tortoise. This is because, by the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting position, the tortoise will have already moved a certain distance. Achilles would then have to travel this same distance, but by the time he covers it, the tortoise will have moved again. With time, Achilles would only grow slower and slower, and hence, he would never be able to overtake the tortoise. It's like every time you divide a number, you would never actually reach 0 but only approach infinitesimally close to it. Inko and Izuku sat through the explanation, trying to process the complex theory. While Inko grasped some of it, everything went over Izuku's head. So, what does that have to do with my son's quirk? Inko asked, a little dazed by the information. Well, you see, your son's quirk is special, the doctor said, a glint of excitement in his eyes, because it aligns so closely with Achilles' paradox. In other words, your son's quirk is literally bringing infinity to reality. Infinity to reality? Inko muttered slowly, the words feeling heavy on her tongue. Aha! The doctor nodded. At first, even we were a little skeptical with our findings, and that's why we decided to do more tests. Your son's quirk literally makes an imaginary figure like infinity into reality. The barrier we witnessed was nothing but his quirk dividing the space between him and the object into an infinite number of spaces. Wow! Inko exclaimed, tears welling up in her eyes. How did you guys figure that out? It wasn't easy to determine, the doctor admitted. In fact, it was precisely this challenge that took us so long to pinpoint exactly what Izuku's quirk was. Do you remember the tests we conducted by throwing those balls at Izuku at different speeds? Inko and Izuku both nodded, their eyes fixed on the doctor. It was initially a test to discern the limits of the barrier's durability, the doctor continued. Many types of barriers falter under high speeds, and frankly, this test wasn't supposed to reveal anything significant. However, one of my interns noticed something peculiar. With the increasing velocity of the balls, they seemed to shift slightly, just by millimeters, but the distance was increasing proportionally. The same intern eventually discovered that the distance was increasing by exactly half of the previous distance. So, for instance, if at test 0, when the ball was moving at velocity v and it stopped x millimeters away from Izuku at test 2, when the ball was moving at twice the velocity, the ball stopped at a distance of x minus x/2 millimeters away. When the doctor finished his explanation, an eerie silence filled the room. Inko stared at him in disbelief, while Izuku looked utterly lost. Is my quirk strong? Izuku asked, his gaze shifting between his mother and the doctor. It is probably the strongest quirk ever registered, young Izuku. The doctor smiled broadly. Izuku's eyes widened in awe. Even stronger than All Might's? The doctor let out a chuckle. Most likely, if we consider the other aspects of your quirk. Wait, there's more to his quirk? Inko asked, thoroughly shocked. Aha! The doctor confirmed, nodding. Besides this quirk, it seems Izuku also has an ocular quirk that greatly enhances his perception. And from what we can gather from our tests, the doctor took a deep breath. This ocular quirk also allows him to see a person's quirk and when they are going to use it. Inko found herself at a loss for words. Yep, we had the same reaction, the doctor said with a sympathetic smile. We don't even have a clear idea of what his ocular quirk does fully, and I believe that we've only scratched the surface. There's a possibility that there are other aspects to his ocular quirk. Your son not only possesses one but two very strong quirks. Inko swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had wanted her son to be strong, but at this point it was almost overwhelming. But it doesn't end there, the doctor added cautiously. There's more. Inko almost yelled, her eyes widening in disbelief. Ahaha! The doctor laughed awkwardly. Yeah, about that. Your son seems to possess a unique energy within his body. Something we've never recorded before. This is a completely new type of energy flowing within him. And we believe that this energy is closely related to his other two quirks. My God! Inko muttered as she took deep breaths to calm herself down. Same reaction, the doctor joked with a chuckle. We have decided that Izuku's ability to make infinity into reality should be called limitless, and his ocular quirk should be called six eyes, like the sixth sense. So, do you guys like it? Yep, Izuku chirped, his eyes bright with excitement. They sound super cool and powerful. Yeah, I know that, the doctor replied with a proud smile. Hero Association headquarters. The next day, three figures stood in a sprawling room, the cityscape of Honai laid out before them through a vast windowed wall. The first was a woman in her late 40s, her ash-blonde hair cascading around a face marked by turquoise eyes and a stern, unyielding expression. She wore a tailored black jacket and dress, accentuated by a purple shirt and a silver necklace that glinted in the harsh light. Seated behind the room's sole desk, she calmly appraised the person standing before her. The second figure was a lanky, middle-aged man with beige, chin-length hair that looked like it had been hastily combed. He was dressed in a crisp black shirt and pants, with a white undershirt and a loosely knotted tie around his neck. Dark circles beneath his eyes spoke volumes about his chronic sleep deprivation. Standing behind the woman, he eyed the individual across from him with a mix of curiosity and caution. The final figure was a striking anomaly, a human-dog hybrid. Tall and robustly built, his visage was that of a beagle, complete with a dark brown patch around his eyes and ears, and a tan line running down his forehead that widened at his muzzle, flecked with pale brown. He had a large, black nose and deep, somber eyes. Despite his otherwise human form, his skin shared the same tan hue as his facial fur. He wore a suit consisting of a dress shirt and waistcoat, over which he donned an unbuttoned black blazer and matching dress pants. A belt with a large buckle and a tie patterned after a Dalmatian's coat completed his ensemble. "So, what do you have for us, Mr. Kenji?" The woman behind the desk inquired, her voice cool and measured. Kenji cleared his throat, his beagle's eyes meeting hers. "As I reported earlier, Miss President, the crime rate has surged significantly over the past 5 years compared to the previous decade." The president's expression darkened, her gaze hardening. She had indeed received and reviewed the reports from the police chief, and the contents were far from reassuring. "I see," she acknowledged, her voice laced with a weighty concern. "I've reviewed the reports, but can you confirm these findings unequivocally, Chief?" The dog-human hybrid nodded somberly, his dark eyes reflecting the gravity of the situation. "I assure you, Miss President, this is not a matter I take lightly. Despite an increase in both heroes and police forces, we are struggling to keep up with the escalating crime rate across the nation." The president of the Public Safety Commission felt a chill run down her spine. She had hoped that, with the fall of the megavillain 5 years ago, peace would finally be restored. But it seemed her optimism had been misplaced. "And unfortunately, that is not the most troubling development," the chief continued, his voice heavy with foreboding. The president, her wariness heightened, fixed him with a steely gaze. "What else, Kenji-san?" The chief of the police force hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "It appears the power of the villain's quirks has also increased significantly." A cold dread washed over the president. "Explain," she commanded, her voice icy as her breath caught in her throat. "Over the past 5 years," the chief began, his tone measured and precise, "we have documented quirks causing devastation on an unprecedented scale. A simple fire quirk incinerated an entire skyscraper without any accelerant. A water-based quirk drowned 100 hostages trapped in a building. A telekinetic quirk, once limited to small objects, was able to lift and hurl an entire building." The chief paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle before he continued. "Consider any incident over the past 5 years," the chief continued, his voice grave. "Simple quirks are causing far more devastation than ever before. Could this be the result of some form of quirk-enhancing drug?" the president queried, her tone sharp. Kenji shook his head. "No, Miss President. We conducted extensive searches and examinations on captured villains. While we found various drugs, none were designed to enhance quirks." The president cast a sidelong glance at her assistant, her mind racing as she awaited further information. "The death toll has also risen dramatically, unsettling the public," the chief continued. "People are beginning to question the effectiveness of our current heroes in protecting them, and they are increasingly skeptical of the government's efforts against villainy." The president closed her eyes, digesting the information with the calm demeanor of someone long accustomed to bearing heavy burdens. Inwardly, however, she was deeply troubled. Though she had known the situation was deteriorating, the sheer scale of the crisis had caught her off guard. Throughout its history, the Hero Public Safety Commission had operated in the shadows, preferring to stay out of the limelight and let heroes do their work. But if things continued this way, they would have no choice but to step into the forefront and take a more proactive stance against the villains. The room fell silent as the weight of the revelations hung heavy in the air. The president's expression remained stoic, even as her mind raced with potential strategies and the grim realization that the commission might need to abandon its passive role to protect the country. But stepping into the limelight would make the commission vulnerable. It could expose the many dark secrets they had buried deep over the last decade. That was a risk she wasn't ready to take. Not yet. However, those concerns could wait. Right now, they had to address the villain problem, and it seemed that stricter measures were in order. Very well, Chief Kenji-san, the president said, her voice firm with resolve. Your report has been noted. The Hero Public Safety Commission will liaise with the government and decide on an appropriate course of action. You may leave. The chief of the police force bowed deeply and exited the room, leaving the president alone with her successor. The president sighed heavily, leaning back in her chair. These are troubling times, Yukimaru. Indeed, they are, ma'am, the lanky man agreed. Then, shifting the mood, he pulled out a file from the ever-present suitcase by his side. However, on a more positive note, I have something of interest. He handed the file to the president. The president raised an eyebrow but accepted the file without question. She knew Yukimaru well enough to trust his judgment. Opening the file, she was immediately struck by the photograph clipped to the front. It depicted a green-haired boy with silver highlights and crystal green eyes that seemed to pierce through the paper, staring straight into her soul. Izuku Midoriya, she murmured, scanning the document. What makes this boy so special, Yukimaru? Please, keep reading, Miss President, Yukimaru urged. You'll understand. As she read on, her eyes widened with each passing line. When she finished, she looked up, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. How is this possible? She whispered. Yukimaru nodded gravely. According to the physician who documented his quirk, Dr. Takahara Gecko, this boy's quirk could potentially be the strongest in existence. They're still uncertain about its full extent, but one aspect allows him to bring what he calls infinity into reality. The president could hardly believe her ears. Her gaze was fixed on the photo of the green-haired boy, her mind racing with the implications. How is this even possible? Yukimaru shook his head. No one knows for sure, but Dr. Gecko believes that the boy's quirk is far more complex than a simple barrier. He believes that what we've seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg. And if that weren't enough, the file mentions 2 additional quirks, an extremely rare occurrence. And then there's the strange energy flowing within him. A mixture of awe and uncertainty played across the president's face as she grappled with the enormity of the revelation. This boy, Izuku Midoriya, could be the key to turning the tide against the rising wave of villainy. But with great power came great risk, and she knew they would need to tread carefully. The president, however, was barely listening to him. Her mind raced through a torrent of thoughts, trying to make sense of the impossible. This couldn't be real. There had to be some sort of mistake. The doctor's assessment had to be a fluke. The doctor, she finally murmured, her face a carefully composed mask. What was his name again?
Takahara Gecko, mam Yukimaru replied promptly.
I see. The president released a measured sigh. Very well. Make contact with the Midoriya family. I want to meet them personally before I can make a judgment. Yukimaru nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Are we considering the Hawk's route, ma'am? The president paused, her expression thoughtful. That will depend entirely on Mr. Izuku Midoriya and his family's cooperation, she said, her voice resolute. In the heavy silence that followed, the weight of the situation seemed almost tangible. The discovery of this extraordinary quirk could change everything, but first they needed to ensure that it was real, and that Izuku Midoriya was everything his file claimed he was. That night, as Inko prepared dinner, a radiant smile stretched across her face. Her eyes darted towards her son, engrossed in play with his all-might figurine. She still couldn't believe the events of the previous day. Her son, Izuku, had not 1, not 2, but 3 quirks, none of them similar to her own or his absentee father's. Each quirk was powerful in its own right. The ability to bring infinity to reality, perceive things at an incredible rate, and see quirks with a strange energy. It all felt surreal, as though she might wake up tomorrow and find it had been a dream. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was that her son had quirks, multiple quirks, and now he could pursue his dream, and she would be by his side, supporting him every step of the way. Just as she finished cooking, there was a knock at the door. She wiped her hands on a cloth and walked over, opening it to find two men in dark suits standing outside. The first was a lanky man with beige, chin-length, messy hair, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. The other had short hair and wore dark sunglasses, even at night. He carried a briefcase. "May I help you?" Inko asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. The lanky man took charge. "Good evening, ma'am. My name is Yukimaru, and this is my partner, Yamamoto. We're from the HPSC, the Hero Public Safety Commission, and we're here to discuss your son. May we come in?" "Of course," Inko replied, stepping aside to let them enter. As they settled in the living room, she noticed both men eyeing Izuku. "Izuku, why don't you go to your room?" she suggested. Izuku complied without protest, darting off to his room and shutting the door behind him. Inko turned her attention back to the two men, gesturing for them to sit. They thanked her and took their seats on the couch, while she brought them each a glass of water. "Thank you for your hospitality, ma'am," Yukimaru said, as Yamamoto nodded in agreement. "Now, perhaps it's time we discuss your son." "Okay," Inko responded, her voice barely audible. Yukimaru began. "Your son's quirk was registered with the government the other day. He's quite an extraordinary young man. Not one, not two, but 3 quirks. You must realize that if this information becomes public, it could put both you and your son in considerable danger." Inko struggled for words, trying to wrap her mind around the sudden reality. She should have expected something like this, but for them to appear at her doorstep so soon after discovering Izuku's quirks was both unsettling and alarming. "You must understand," Yukimaru continued, his tone grave. "This knowledge makes both you and your son prime targets. We need to discuss how to proceed." Inko gulped. Her heart pounded, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to breathe. "That's why we have an offer for you," Yukimaru said, smiling reassuringly. "Well, at least an offer that the president of the HPSC would like to discuss with both of you, Miss Midoriya. The president would like to meet and talk about Izuku's future." "Discuss Izuku's future?" Inko murmured, confusion lacing her voice. Yukimaru nodded. "Yes, his future. The president has taken a special interest in Izuku and sees great potential in him. So she wants to train him or something." Inko tried to piece the implications together, her mind racing with possibilities. "That depends entirely on how the meeting goes," Yukimaru replied. "If everything goes well, then we will ensure Izuku trains with the best of the best." "And what if the meeting doesn't go well?" Inko pressed, her brow furrowed with concern. "Then, we will respect your decision and not disturb you further," Yukimaru assured her. "But we guarantee to protect Izuku's identity. And if you wish, we can provide you with the contact details of some excellent trainers for Izuku to work with." "And what stops me from rejecting the offer and choosing the second route?" Inko questioned, her voice firm. "As I'm trying to explain, Miss Midoriya," Yukimaru began, his tone measured, "Izuku has great potential. The HPSC would like to nurture him into a great hero. Aha! But visiting our house the same day we found out about Izuku's quirks isn't exactly a great way to win favors," Inko said, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I understand your apprehension," Yukimaru acknowledged. "But you also have to understand why we acted so quickly. If we don't, it gives more chance for Izuku's quirks to go public, and villains will undoubtedly seek him out." Inko hesitated, recognizing the truth in his words. No one had ever been born with 3 quirks before. The implications were frightening. Villains would target Izuku to exploit his abilities for their own gain. "If you allow us to train him, Miss Midoriya," Yukimaru said with utmost seriousness, "we will ensure that Izuku becomes even greater than All Might." Suddenly, the door to Izuku's room burst open, and he came rushing into the living room. "Mom, please accept the offer." Inko looked at Izuku with uncertainty. "What? You don't have to leave him nor do anything, Miss Midoriya," Yukimaru repeated. "You can be by his side while we train him. We won't do anything illegal or unethical. Every day he'd still come home to you. All we require is to train him during the day and afternoon. That's all we ask, Miss Midoriya." I guess," Inko stammered, still unsure if her decision was right. We will see. However, Yukimaru began, a hint of gravitas in his voice. It would be advisable if you considered relocating to a more secure location. This would allow us to provide enhanced protection for both you and Izuku. Don't worry, the HPSC will cover all the costs. Can I become like All Might? Izuku asked, his eyes wide with excitement and hope. Yukimaru smiled warmly. Dear Izuku, you will not only become like All Might, but you have the potential to surpass him. That midnight, Takahara Gekko was a revered doctor in one of the most prestigious hospitals of Mizudafu City. Known for his chivalry and kindness, he was a figure who seemed incapable of wrongdoing. Colleagues held him in high regard for his warmth, and patients adored him for his gentle bedside manner. With over a decade in the medical profession, nothing could have prepared him for the shock he received that afternoon. How was it possible for a child to be born with not one, not two, but 3 quirks? The notion baffled him, and he spent the entire evening in his office, scrutinizing the reports from the battery of tests conducted on the boy. There were no errors. As always, neither he nor his team had made any mistakes. The boy truly possessed 3 quirks. And then there was the peculiar similarity between the boy's quirk and the legend that had swept the world. A story of a man who lived before the age of quirks. This man could create barriers around himself like Izuku and was so powerful that he could level an entire city block with a single attack. It was even rumored that he could annihilate everyone on the planet if he so desired. The doctor had partly named the quirk Limitless because of its resemblance to the legendary man's unnatural abilities. A sudden knock on the office door jolted him from his thoughts. Yes, he called out. There is someone here to meet you, Dr. Gekko. The nurse responded from the other side of the door. Is it an emergency? Gekko inquired. Yes, she says so. Please send her in, he instructed. A few moments later, the door to the office opened and a woman walked in. Gekko's eyes widened, and he felt a flush spreading across his face as he took in the woman's figure. The woman was the most beautiful creature he had ever encountered. She looked like an angel with an angular face, dark red hair, and equally red, ruby-like eyes. She was dressed in a business suit and pants, with a white shirt partially unbuttoned beneath the coat, offering a glimpse of her perfect cleavage. Good evening, Dr. Gekko, the woman said with a voice so smooth it sent shivers down the doctor's spine. You are far more handsome than I had thought. Gekko nervously swallowed. Please sit down, he said, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. And, how can I help you? He struggled to maintain a professional demeanor, but was failing miserably. The woman giggled as she took a seat. She crossed her legs, and though she was wearing pants, the posture was far more sensual than Gekko had expected. You seem nervous, she teased mischievously. Of course not, ma'am, Gekko stammered, his mind a whirlwind of confusion as he fought to maintain his composure. Something felt deeply off. His thoughts veered into untrodden territories he never imagined existed within himself. How can I help you? He managed, feeling a wave of frustration at his own stutter. This had never happened before. The woman leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk and supporting her face with her palms. The movement accentuated her cleavage, which threatened to spill out of her partially unbuttoned shirt. Just the mere utterance of a single letter from the woman's lips caused Gekko's manhood to stir, a sensation he couldn't comprehend. From the moment she entered the room, his body had betrayed him in ways he couldn't understand. I just found out about this little boy from a friend of mine, the woman said, her voice dripping with sensuality. You wouldn't happen to know anything about this boy with 3 quirks, would you? I'm sorry, ma'am. But our hospital maintains strict confidentiality regarding our patients' quirks. It's to respect their privacy, ma'am, Gekko replied, clinging to his professional boundaries despite the chaotic thoughts swirling in his mind. I'm quite sure you can tell me, Dr. Gekko? Please? She purred, her eyes never leaving his. I am sorry, ma'am. But I can't, Gekko insisted, his resolve wavering as his mind wrestled against the allure of the woman's request. Oh, pooh, the woman pouted, causing Gekko to twitch involuntarily. I guess I have no other option then. With a fluid motion, she stood from her seat and slipped off her suit jacket. What are you doing, ma'am? Gekko asked, shock and alarm coursing through him. The woman didn't respond with words. Instead, she pounced on him, leaping over the desk like a predator on the hunt. She seized his hand and, without warning, pressed it firmly against her left breast. Gekko's eyes widened in shock. He looked up at the woman and was met with a predatory gaze, her cheeks flushed with arousal. Oh, doctor, she cooed, her voice laced with dark allure. Do you have a family? Yes. Please let go, Gekko exclaimed, fear gripping his heart. Do you have a wife? Children? She persisted, her breath hot against his ear. Wife and 2 children, Gekko blurted out, his eyes widening in realization that he had spoken without his consent. He stared at the woman, finally comprehending that she was no ordinary person. She was a literal devil. I will pray for them, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. So that they can find it in themselves to forgive you, Doctor. What do you want from me? Gekko asked, his voice trembling with fear. Hi, the woman giggled, her laughter like a chill down Gekko's spine. So glad that it's working. She placed a gentle hand on his cheek, her touch surprisingly soft. Don't worry, she soothed. Once I'm done with you, not only will you tell me everything about the boy, but you will also become one of my precious puppets. And with that, the woman leaned in and kissed him. Gekko's eyes widened in shock, and then darkness claimed him as he lost consciousness. Inko's gaze traveled over the room she had lived in for so many years. Small though it was, the memories housed within its walls were countless. The space was austere, holding only a bed, a desk, and a mirror. Inko had always been frugal, never indulging in makeup, furniture, or other luxuries. The bulk of her income went toward Izuku's schooling and rent, leaving little room for her own desires. She walked over to the bed and sat down, a faint smile playing on her lips as it creaked under her weight. This bed was as old as she was, a relic from her childhood home that she had brought with her after marrying her husband. She leaned back, propping herself up on her palms, her face etched with a mix of nostalgia and melancholy. She had truly been in love back then, hadn't she? Defying her family and friends to marry a man with no source of income, she had been blinded by passion and youthful rebellion. Her parents had warned her, but she hadn't listened. They had wed in a church, and upon returning home, she faced the exact treatment she had anticipated. Her father barred her from entering the house, and her mother turned her back on her. Most of her friends had also severed ties, not that she did not expect that. A week later, while walking through the familiar streets of her childhood, she saw her old bed discarded in a dumpster, no doubt by her father. She brought it home, convincing her husband to let her keep it. Over time, the bed became a cherished memento, a final gift from her parents. It was only 2 years later that she discovered they were both gone, buried in the cemetery. She visited their graves just once, overwhelmed by guilt and the stark reality of their deaths. The fact that she was not there during her parents' last moments would forever etch itself in her already bad conscience. Inko's lips curved into a soft smile as she remembered that same year. She had been blessed with Izuku, the greatest gift of her life. She recalled staring at the green-haired baby, crying its eyes out with a mixture of awe and love. She still couldn't believe that such a beautiful being could come from her. She had no idea how long she had gazed at him, but at that moment, she knew she would give her life for this child. Releasing a sigh, she looked up at the ceiling, her thoughts swirling. And then, her husband had disappeared, no contact, no message, nothing. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the planet. She filed a missing person report with the police, but after a year, they brought the news that he was dead, his body found near the forested area of Kyoto. The news shattered what remained of Inko's spirit. In just 2 years, she had lost everyone who mattered. It was a brutal time, but she persevered, driven by the need to care for Izuku and herself. Her son was her anchor, the sole reason she held on. She had soon found a job as an accountant in a small firm. It did not pay well, but considering the job market, it was the only thing she could get with her commerce degree. At least, it paid enough to support both her and Izuku and put 2 square meals on the table a day. Thankfully, her one remaining friend, Mitsuki Bakugo, had been a steadfast support during those dark days. But even that friendship hadn't survived. Their last conversation still weighed heavily on her mind. After what Mitsuki's son had done to Izuku, Inko had let her anger flare, unleashing a tirade on the blonde-haired woman. Mitsuki had listened silently, only responding at the end with a quiet, "I am sorry, Inko. I will make sure that never happens." Inko sighed deeply. She hadn't spoken to Mitsuki since that day and didn't know if she ever could again. The things she had said that day over the phone would hurt any sane person, and Mitsuki was a hot-headed one. Her melancholic thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door to her room. She lifted her head from the bed to see Izuku peeking in. "Can I come in, Mom?" the green-haired boy asked hesitantly. Inko sat up. "Yes, Izu-chan. Please come in," she said, her voice gentle. Izuku entered the room, standing before her with a mixture of hesitation and shyness. "Mom, are you and Aunt Mitsuki not talking?" he asked, avoiding her gaze. He knew his mother would often go to Aunt Mitsuki's house with him right at this hour. But since the last few days she had not even mentioned Aunt Mitsuki's name. Inko closed her eyes, rubbing the bridge of her nose as tears welled up. "You know, Mom," Izuku continued, shifting uncomfortably and tracing a circle on the floor with his toe, "I don't want you to lose your friend just because Katsuki and I fight. Why, you can still be friends with her, right?" "Oh, Izuku," Inko cried out, pulling her son into a tight embrace. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks. "When did you become so mature?" she sobbed. "Please don't cry, Mom. I didn't want to make you cry. I am sorry," Izuku pleaded, his voice laced with guilt. Inko started to rock softly, Izuku in her arms, laughter bubbling through her tears. "I'm not crying, silly. These are tears of happiness." She spoke softly, running her fingers through Izuku's hair. "Please don't grow up so quickly." Suddenly, there was a knock at the front door. Inko let go of Izuku and left her room, approaching the door with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. She opened it to find a young man in a blue-white uniform. "I'm here to pick you up, ma'am," the young man informed her. "Oh, has the HPC president sent you?" Inko asked, giving a suspicious look at the man. The young man simply provided a nod. "Please wait a minute. I am coming," Inko informed and closed the door. "Are we going to meet the president?" Izuku asked from behind her. "Yes," Inko replied. "Now go and get dressed." "About Aunt Mitsuki? Unfortunately, she is away right now with her family," Inko lied with a strained smile. Izuku looked downtrodden as he murmured, "Oh, come on. Go get ready," Inko said encouragingly and pushed Izuku into the house gently. "All right, before your meeting with the president, there are a few things you should know," Yukimaru said, glancing at Inko and Izuku through the rearview mirror of the sleek black sedan. They were cruising through Tokyo, heading toward the HPSC. Yukimaru sat in the front, next to the driver, while the mother and son were in the back. "The president is a very busy woman," Yukimaru continued, his expression serious. "She has numerous responsibilities and rarely meets people unless absolutely necessary. But you two are different. Izuku, you might just be the potential successor to All Might once he retires. So, the president is making an exception to meet you." He turned his gaze back to the road. "Truth be told, I was supposed to oversee Izuku's training and development. But for some reason, the president wants to take a more hands-on approach in grooming him as a hero. Something that's never happened before. So, Izuku is quite the special case. It sounds like she's doing us a favor by meeting us," Inko remarked, a frown of irritation creasing her forehead. "We didn't ask for her involvement." "You didn't, but the circumstances did," Yukimaru replied, his tone neutral. "And you should consider yourselves fortunate. Very few people have had the privilege of meeting her in person, and now you're among those select few." "That doesn't exactly make me feel good," Inko said flatly. "Well, if it helps, Having her as a connection can provide you with significant political leverage, Yukimaru explained matter-of-factly. She's politically influential and often shares the room with the Japanese Prime Minister and President. Unfortunately, during the height of the civil war between heroes and villains in the Golden Age, Japan's royal family was killed. As a result, the office of the president was established as the head of state. Otherwise, Madam President would have connections with the emperor himself. And how is that going to be useful to us? Inko asked, her eyebrows rising in surprise. If you ever decide to run for prime minister or if you encounter issues with a politician, the president will likely assist you, Yukimaru said. Inko stared at him, incredulous, unable to comprehend how he'd reached the conclusion that she or Izuku would run for the prime minister's position or get entangled in political affairs. Thanks. That makes so much sense, she said dryly. Wow, we can run for prime minister? Izuku exclaimed, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He turned sharply toward Inko. Mom, let's run for prime minister when I grow up. You can be the prime minister, and I'll be the president. No. Izuku, you should never get involved in politics, Inko exclaimed, desperately trying to steer her son away from this new aspiration. That's a bad goal, Inko asserted. But why? Izuku questioned, his eyes wide with confusion. Because politics is the dirtiest career there is, Inko exclaimed, her voice edged with panic. Izuku's eyes sparkled even brighter, and he set his jaw with determination. All right then, once I become the strongest hero, I'm going to run for prime minister. And when I win, I'll make politics the cleanest career ever. And no, Inko cried, tears welling up in her eyes. Why did her son always have to be such a sweet, naive idiot? Her gaze narrowed, and she shot a dangerous glare at the back of Yukimaru's head. Yukimaru, who had been amused by Izuku's newfound aspiration, suddenly felt an icy chill run down his spine. He glanced back, his amusement fading quickly when he saw Inko's dark glare, her hair seeming to float behind her like a spectral halo, glowing an almost neon green. Inko leaned forward, her face now uncomfortably close to Yukimaru's ear. Look what you did, idiot! She hissed, her voice laced with fury. You're corrupting my son. If you so much as corrupt him any further, I will find you and make you suffer the consequences myself. Yukimaru held his tongue, knowing that if Izuku started training under their tutelage, he would be exposed to even more corruption. Fortunately for him, Izuku Midoriya would likely never find out. He hoped. The rest of the journey to the HPSC was shrouded in silence, with Izuku gazing eagerly at the passing buildings through the window. When they finally reached their destination, Yukimaru stepped out of the car and opened the door for Inko and Izuku. All right, I will escort you to Miss President's office. After that, you're on your own, Yukimaru informed them. Inko nodded, taking Izuku's small hand in her own as they followed Yukimaru through the building. They stopped first at the reception desk, where Yukimaru spoke quietly with the female receptionist. He returned a few moments later and gestured for them to follow him further. Inko and Izuku trailed behind Yukimaru to an elevator. Inside, the lanky man pressed the button for the 111th floor, the topmost level of the building. For minutes of awkward silence later, they arrived at their destination. As Inko stepped out of the elevator, she was struck by the unusual atmosphere of the floor. It looked nothing like any office she had ever seen. Directly ahead, a few feet from the elevator, stood a single, heavy metal door secured with large iron bolts around its perimeter. The entire floor seemed to be made of thick metal layers, giving it an eerie, oppressive feel. Yukimaru approached the door and knocked firmly. "Come in," a voice called from within. Yukimaru turned back to the mother-son duo. "Before you go in, a word of warning. Miss President can be very blunt with her words. I suggest you take them lightly. Most of the time, she doesn't mean what she says." Inko nodded, and Yukimaru pushed the door open. She and Izuku stepped into the room, the heavy door closing behind them with a resounding thud. As Inko looked around, she felt a wave of unease wash over her. The room was large and seemingly designed to intimidate. Directly opposite them was a floor-to-ceiling window stretching the length of the wall, offering a panoramic view of the city below. Before the window sat a lone desk, behind which someone was seated in a high-back chair, facing outward through the tall window. "Welcome, Miss Izuku Midoriya and Izuku Midoriya," the person in the chair greeted without turning around. The voice was calm and measured, exuding an air of experience and authority. Inko instinctively knew that whoever sat in that chair was not someone to be trifled with. The chair swiveled around, revealing a middle-aged woman with ash-blonde hair, her expression stoic and steely. She wore a sharp black suit jacket paired with a dress, the picture of professionalism. "Nice to finally meet you both in person," the president of HPSC said, her tone firm yet polite. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk, and interlaced her fingers, her chin perched atop them. "Please, don't let me keep you standing." She gestured to two cushioned chairs in front of her desk, their Victorian design contrasting with the modern ambience of the room. "Thank you," Inko replied quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced at Izuku, who looked just as uncomfortable. Taking his hand, she led him to the chairs before the president's desk. "Am I making you uncomfortable?" the president asked abruptly. Inko flinched at the blunt question. Yukimaru wasn't kidding about her directness, she thought to herself. "Why yes," Izuku stammered, his nervousness evident. Inko winced again, cursing herself for not answering quickly enough. The president hummed thoughtfully. "I've heard that sharing a cup of tea can make important discussions go more smoothly. Would you like some tea, Miss Inko?" Her gaze, emotionless and piercing, never left Inko's face. Before Inko could respond, something strange happened. A cup of tea appeared out of nowhere on the desk in front of her. "Huh?" she murmured, her eyes widening. "No?" the president inquired, not waiting for an answer. "How about coffee?" Inko began, but again, she felt an odd sensation. A steaming cup of coffee materialized before her on the desk. "Does that suffice?" the president asked, her tone impassive. I would have preferred green tea," Inko managed to say. "Health conscious? I appreciate that." The president nodded almost imperceptibly. This time, instead of appearing on the desk, the cup of green tea materialized directly in Inko's hands, startling her. The president then turned her attention to Izuku. "And what would you prefer, dear?" "Orange juice," Izuku exclaimed, and a second later, he was holding a glass of freshly squeezed orange juice. "Wow!" he exclaimed again, his eyes sparkling with wonder and awe. "Is that your quirk?" "Indeed it is," the president answered, a small, barely detectable smirk playing on her lips. "What is it? Can you please tell me?" "Please," Izuku blurted out quickly, unable to contain his excitement. "Why don't you try to figure it out yourself?" the president countered, a hint of amusement in her voice. Izuku looked at her with renewed determination. "All right, I'm going to find out about your quirk, no matter how long it takes me." "Believe it," the president hummed and gave a slight nod. Her eyes scanned her desk until they found a paperweight. She picked it up and, without warning, flung it gently towards Izuku, causing a ripple of surprise among the room's occupants. However, the paperweight never reached Izuku. It stopped a few inches away from the boy, floating in the air as if suspended by some invisible thread. "So, they were right," the president whispered, her voice a mix of amazement and disbelief. "It definitely is the—" "What are you doing?" Inko yelled, outraged at the audacity of the woman to throw a paperweight at Izuku without a care. She jumped out of her seat, slamming her palms against the mahogany desk of the president. "What would you have done if that had hit him?" Inko hissed. "I am sorry, Izuku." The president apologized directly, her expression turning serious. She then addressed Inko. "I would have healed him, and if that hadn't been sufficient, I would have arranged for the best doctors in the country to treat Izuku." "And that makes it better?" Inko asked, her voice dripping with outrage. The president shook her head. "Of course it does not. And for that, I apologize again." My curiosity got the better of me. Inko glared at the woman and took her seat again. Don't make that mistake again, the green-haired woman said scathingly. The president smiled reassuringly. Of course, Miss Midoriya. She turned her attention back to Izuku. So, Izuku, that barrier of yours, did it activate itself, or did you activate it yourself? Izuku let the paperweight fall into his right palm and placed it on the table. I activated it myself. I have to think about it, kind of, for it to work. Interesting, the president murmured almost to herself. So, pretty much instantaneous activation, She stared at Izuku thoughtfully and nodded her head. Why don't you finish your drink? And then Yukimaru can give you a tour of the facilities you're going to use during your training? All right, Izuku exclaimed happily, chugging down his drink. He jumped down from the chair and dashed towards the door. Watching Izuku run towards the door, the president pressed a button on her desk and said, Yukimaru, take Izuku for a tour of the facilities. Yes, ma'am, came Yukimaru's voice from the other side of the speaker. Now that we have this room to ourselves, the president began once Izuku was out of the room. She looked at Inko and continued, we can start to discuss a few things. Inko sat rigidly, her heart pounding like a drum. She was alone in a room with quite possibly the most powerful person she had ever encountered. Fear gripped her, fear for Izuku and for herself. What have I gotten myself into? She wondered, her mind racing. You have raised him well, the president stated calmly, stirring a spoon in a cup of tea that had materialized out of thin air. I see you have not touched your tea. You should not drink cold tea, Miss Midoriya. It is harmful. I am sorry, Inko stuttered, clutching her cup with both hands. She brought the cup to her nose and took a tentative sniff. Nothing seemed amiss. That isn't poisoned, if that's what you're thinking, the president said, her voice crisp and clear. Inko flinched at the president's cold tone. She looked up to find the president's gaze fixed not on her, but intently on the tea she was stirring. You know, Miss Midoriya, the president began, her voice softening slightly. It is nice to see a caring mother who loves her son and a son who loves her equally in return. Thanks, Inko replied, unsure of how to respond to the unexpected compliment. You do not know how cruel this world is, the president continued, taking a sip from her cup. It is extremely rare for me to find a mother-son duo who are actually on good terms. I have lost count of the number of parents who would sell their children for a handful of cash. Is it that bad? Inko asked, her voice barely above a whisper. It must be a blessing to live a life of ignorance and bliss, huh? The president murmured, her voice low yet carrying clearly in the quiet room. She shifted her chair slightly, allowing her to gaze out the window with just a tilt of her head. This world, it has been cursed since quirks came into our society. Why do you say that? Inko questioned, wondering why she was even engaging in this conversation. You see the news, don't you? The president asked. Yes, Inko answered, her eyes widening slightly at the question. The atrocities they show you on the news are just the tip of the iceberg. If they showed what is happening in the shadows, there would be total anarchy. Why are we having this conversation? I thought you wanted to talk about Izuku, Inko said, her voice trembling slightly. But if you keep saying things like this, it will only make me want to withdraw him from here. But you can't, Miss Midoriya, the president replied calmly. What do you mean? Inko asked, her brow furrowing with concern. Because the moment Izuku awakened his quirk, his fate was intertwined with the entire world, the president said, her voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo through the room. Is that supposed to mean anything? Inko asked, her brow furrowing in confusion. You don't understand, do you, Miss Midoriya? The president continued, her gaze unwavering. Izuku is an extremely special child. His birth may have altered the very fabric of our reality. He is the door that will lead us all out of the darkness. He, Miss Midoriya, is the light at the end of the darkest tunnel. You sound like a religious zealot, Inko muttered, her voice laced with unease. I apologize if I frightened you, Miss Midoriya, the president said, her tone softening slightly. Please, Forget I said anything. Forget what you said? How can I do that? Inko asked, her voice quivering. The president chuckled softly, almost to herself. Just consider it as the delusions of a salesperson trying to convince you to invest in our cause. Inko remained silent, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. If you don't mind me asking, the president began, her voice growing serious again. Who is Izuku's father? Izuku's father? Inko murmured, taken aback. Why do you want to know? Miss Midoriya. The president uttered her name coldly, causing Inko to physically cringe. It is important for me to know who exactly Izuku's father is. There are many questions that could be answered if you simply tell me about him. I'm sorry, Inko said softly, but I'm not comfortable discussing my husband. I understand your reluctance to speak about your late husband, Miss Midoriya. The president insisted, her voice firm. But it would greatly assist me if I could learn the man's name. Inko placed her cup on the desk and stood up suddenly. She bowed respectfully. I am sorry, but I think we have to cut this conversation short. I thought we would be discussing Izuku's training, but it seems you are not interested in him. Thank you for your time. We will be leaving now. Inko turned around and began walking hastily towards the exit door. Wait, Miss Midoriya? The president called out, rising from her seat and slamming her palms against the desk, her voice cold and stern. I understand if I made you uncomfortable. I give you my word, you will not hear me mention your husband again. So please stop. We can continue our discussion about Izuku's training. Inko stopped at the door, her hand gripping the knob tightly. I don't think we have anything to discuss, Madam President. And as for Izuku's training, my son is intelligent enough to figure out his own quirk, and I will enroll him in a good martial arts class to learn fighting. You are not seeing the bigger picture, Miss Midoriya, the president said, her voice filled with desperation and urgency. Izuku's quirk is not only dangerous, but if we do not cultivate it properly, he will never reach the heights of All Might. As I said, Madam President, Inko replied, her voice as cold as ice. She didn't turn around. Instead, she kept her gaze fixed on the doorknob. My son is smart enough to figure out his quirk, and with or without your help, he is going to be a great hero. Veins bulged across the president's face as her muscles tightened in anger. Her eyes flashed red, the veins standing out starkly. You do not understand the dangers that await you, Miss Midoriya, she hissed through gritted teeth. Izuku's quirk will attract predators of the highest degree. Neither of you will be safe. You need us. No, Madam President, Inko said, her hand on the doorknob. It isn't us but you who needs us, and I am quite sure we will be able to manage just fine. After all, we've managed until now. Have a good day. And with that, Inko walked out of the room. The HPSC president could only watch as the woman walked away. Her hands rolled into fists, and she cursed loudly. She slumped back into her chair, releasing a sigh before relaxing her tense shoulders. Damn overprotective parents. No wonder I hate them. A few seconds later, Yukimaru walked into the room and stood before her desk. Should we move forward with Plan B, ma'am? No, the president said, spinning her chair around to face the large window and stare out at the city. That won't be necessary. Izuku is bound to come to us in time. Someone like him won't be able to escape his fate for long. The reflection of the sun through the glass illuminated the room. The president basked in its warmth as she murmured, all we have to do is wait for the right time. A month later, Inko Midoriya stood in her kitchen, methodically preparing dinner for the two of them. The day had been chaotic, but as always, she had made it through. Things had been tense between them since their visit to the HPSC. Izuku had been both sad and angry, upset at her for breaking the deal with the HPSC. She understood his frustration. Mr. Mera had sold him a dream, the dream of surpassing All Might, and Izuku had believed it with the innocence of a child. But she had stood in his way, shattering that dream. Yet, her son was a good boy, understanding and kind. Once she explained her worries, he had calmed down. He was no longer angry but still a little sad. Something about the HPSC felt off to her. She couldn't put her finger on it, But something was wrong with that woman. And then there was the fact that she couldn't remember her face. Not her hair color, not her lips, not her eyes. Nothing. It was as if she had never met her, though she knew she had. Was that her quirk? But wasn't her quirk conjuring something from nothing? The president made no sense to her. It was a good thing she had walked out of that room that day. She had no idea what the woman would have done to Izuku if she hadn't. Izu-chan, dinner is ready, Inko called out, her voice echoing through the small apartment. The sound of Izuku's door opening reached her ears, and soon he appeared in the dining room. Inko looked at her son and smiled, though her smile wavered slightly when she saw the thick black sunglasses covering his eyes. A week ago, when she had returned from work, Izuku had come to her late at night, complaining that his eyes had been irritating him all day. Worried, Inko had taken him to the hospital the very next day. She was grateful to her understanding employer for giving her a half-day leave. But when she had inquired about Dr. Gecko at the hospital, the receptionist informed her that he had resigned. Fortunately, another doctor was arranged to examine Izuku. After a thorough examination that took nearly an hour, the doctor recommended Izuku wear a blindfold or thick sunglasses. For that day, Izuku had worn bandages around his eyes, but Inko had bought him sunglasses, which he had been wearing since. They seemed to help somewhat. Izuku took his usual spot at the dining table. "How was your day, Izu-chan?" Inko asked, taking her seat. Izuku shrugged. "Like usual. The teachers seem a little friendlier these days." Izuku Midoriya managed a difficult smile, masking the guilt that churned within her. It was another stark reminder that Izuku had endured bullying from both students and teachers for an entire year, and she had been oblivious. She shuddered to think what might have happened if Izuku had never awakened his quirk. "Oh, and Kaken didn't come today either," Izuku said, his voice distant. "That makes it a whole month of him being absent. I wonder why." "I see," Inko murmured, keeping her gaze fixed on her bowl. She knew exactly why. Rumors had reached her that Katsuki had been sent to a rehabilitation and disciplinary school, prohibited from leaving until his behavior improved. Good thing they decided to teach him a lesson, Inko thought, a bitter edge to her thoughts. "I wonder how Mitsuki is coping. Maybe I should call her and say sorry. Those things that I said that day. She did not deserve to hear those words." "How about you, Mom?" Izuku asked, pulling her from her thoughts. Inko looked up at her son and mustered a smile. "It was boring. You know how it is for me. Just managing balance sheets all day." Izuku took a bite of the fish and asked, "Why don't you look for a job at another place?" "I think I will," Inko sighed. "It would be good for me to find something more challenging. Not just sitting behind a desk staring at a computer all day. But finding the right job is really difficult." "I'm sure you can do it, Mom," Izuku said encouragingly. "Oh, thank you, Izu-chan." Suddenly, the doorbell rang, shattering the quiet of their dinner. "Who could it be at this hour?" Inko questioned, standing up from her chair. She washed her hands in the sink and walked toward the front door. "Should I come with you?" Izuku asked, his voice laced with concern. "You eat deer," Inko replied. She approached the door, her hand wrapping around the doorknob, a sense of unease creeping up her spine. She turned the knob and opened the door, her eyes widening in shock. Standing before her was a dark figure, looming ominously. The man was shrouded in a dark hoodie, the hood concealing his face in shadows. He wore dark pants that matched the rest of his attire. "May I help you?" Inko asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," the man replied, his voice sending a chill down her spine. "By dying." Inko's eyes widened in terror, but before she could react, excruciating pain exploded in her abdomen. Her hands shook uncontrollably as her gaze trailed down, horror gripping her heart as she saw the man's hand extended towards her, a knife embedded in her stomach. "Goodbye, Missy," the man said, yanking the knife out with nonchalance. Inko staggered backward, her back hitting the wall. She looked up as the man stepped into her home, his intentions clear. What do you want?" she gasped, coughing up copious amounts of blood. "Your son, of course," the man sneered, a chilling giggle echoing through the room. Terror gripped Inko as the man's words carved a chilling path through her mind. "Why?" she gasped, her voice choked with agony. "Heard the kid has 3 quirks," the man sneered. "You know how valuable that makes him? He'd fetch billions, maybe even trillions of yen with the right buyer." He giggled maliciously. Inko's voice trembled with rage and pain.
You bastard.
The thought lingered, poisoning her mind. So, the president was right all along. "Mom!" Izuku's voice cut through the air, sharp with concern. Inko's eyes widened in realization that Izuku was heading toward the hallway. "Mom, are you all right?" Izuku asked as he stepped into the hallway, oblivious to the danger. His gaze finally landed on the dark figure looming in the doorway. His eyes followed the trail of blood, finding his mother crumpled on the floor, a growing pool of crimson beneath her. His eyes widened in horror. "Wah?" The words caught in his throat. Is that blood? So you're the brat, huh?" The man leered, his gaze raking over Izuku dismissively. "You don't seem like anything special." "Izuku," Inko called out, her voice frail yet urgent. Run." Izuku took a step back, hesitating for a split second before turning and dashing toward the kitchen. The man, surprised by the sudden movement, snapped into action. "Hey, brat, wait," he barked, racing after Izuku into the kitchen. As he entered, his gaze flicked to the right, eyebrows rising slightly when he spotted Izuku clutching a plate. Izuku hurled the plate at the man, who calmly lifted an arm and caught it with ease. "Pathetic," the man scoffed. "If you think that's going to work." He smirked, his eyes gleaming with malice. "Now, give up this futile attempt and come with me, brat." But Izuku wasn't deterred. He continued to fling cutlery at the man, each piece caught or deflected effortlessly. "Are you done?" The man growled, his patience waning. Izuku, however, was far from finished. Realizing he had momentarily distracted the man, he snatched a knife from the kitchen counter and launched it at him with all his might. The man's reflexes were swift, but the force of the knife caught him off guard. He raised his arm to block it, but the blade pierced through his flesh, eliciting a hiss of pain. "Damn you, kid! Are you trying to kill me?" he snarled. Indeed, the knife would have killed him had he not intercepted it with his arm, as it was heading straight for his face. The intruder grunted, his gaze fixed on the knife embedded in his arm. "Now you're going to pay," he threatened, wrenching the knife free. He discarded the blood-covered blade and scanned the counter for Izuku, only to find the spot empty. "Huh!" Confusion surged within him as he realized the boy was gone. Suddenly, a weight crashed onto the man's shoulders from behind, causing him to stumble forward. Izuku had used the distraction of the knife to slip out of the man's view, but he knew running wouldn't solve anything. He couldn't leave his mother to die, and the man would catch up to him eventually. So he grabbed a nail from the corner of the kitchen counter and crept up behind the man. Seizing his chance, Izuku leaped onto the man's back, targeting his shoulders, and drove the nail into the man's right eye. A horrifying scream ripped from the man's throat as he clutched his injured eye with one hand, grabbing Izuku by the shirt with the other. He flung Izuku to the kitchen floor with brutal force. Izuku yelped in pain as his back slammed into the hard ground. He scrambled to get up, but before he could regain his footing, the man seized him by the back of the neck, spinning him around to face him. "Look what you did, you fucking brat!" the man bellowed, his voice a mix of agony and rage. Indeed, Izuku had inflicted significant damage. The man's eye was a bloody mess. "You know, I was going to spare you some hell," the man hissed, both angry and in pain. "But no, I am going to make you my slave. You will rot in hell forever, you bast dash." He stopped mid-sentence as pain exploded through his back. The intruder's grip on Izuku loosened, and he slowly stood up, his body rigid with shock. Izuku dropped to the ground, coughing and gasping from the painful grip the man had had on his neck. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. The man stood frozen, his eyes turned upward, noticing 3 knives floating ominously above him. To his right, a dozen forks pointed menacingly toward him. To his left, broken glass bottles dangled dangerously in the air, their sharp edges aimed at him. He was surrounded by kitchen utensils, all seemingly animated with a deadly intent. The intruder slowly turned around, and his eyes widened further as he saw the green-haired woman standing at the kitchen door, supporting her weight with her hand which were gripping the door frame tightly. Her hair was splayed across her face, casting sinister shadows that made her look like a vengeful demon. Blood dripped from her chin and stomach, yet she stood as if nothing was wrong. Her crystal eyes glowed menacingly, like those of a predator locked onto its prey. "How dare you touch my son?" Inko uttered each word with a chilling, demonic intensity. She raised her left hand and faced her palm toward the intruder. "Listen, woman." The intruder tried to speak, but he never finished his words as Inko closed her fist. Knives, forks, glass shards, and broken plates all pierced the intruder in multiple places, including vital spots. Blood gushed from the man's eyes, ears, and mouth, streaming from the countless wounds ravaging his body as he collapsed to the ground in a lifeless heap. Inko, unable to support herself anymore, crumpled to her knees. With her left hand, she clutched the stab wound on her stomach. Her right hand grasped the doorframe for support. "Mom!" Izuku cried out, sprinting towards his mother, leaping over the intruder's corpse. He knelt beside her, his voice filled with fear and desperation. "Mom, are you all right?" Tears streamed down his cheeks. Inko slowly turned her head towards Izuku and offered a pained, blood-streaked smile. "It's all right, Izu," she whispered, only to cough up more blood. Mom, what should I do?" "You're bleeding too much," Izuku pleaded, panic rising in his voice. Inko raised her weak left hand and pulled Izuku into a trembling embrace. "Izu-chan, remember, Mama loves you. Okay. Never believe otherwise. Mama loves you very much. Mom, please don't talk. I will call Aunt Mitsuki. She will know what to do." Izuku sobbed into Inko's chest. "Don't cry, Izu-chan. Heroes don't cry. Remember." Inko wheezed, her words punctuated by pain. "And great heroes smile through hardships and laugh in the face of evil." Each word was a struggle, but she pressed on, knowing these were her final words. "Mom, please don't leave me," Izuku begged, his body shaking with sobs. "Izu-chan, Mama is going nowhere. She will always be there, by your side, watching over you. So fight and become a greater hero than All Might." Inko started to sob herself, the agony of her impending death tearing at her heart. "I will be watching. Always. No, don't go. Don't go. Please. Why? Why?" Izuku's cries echoed through the room. Finally, Inko's strength gave out, and her left hand, which had been holding Izuku in a desperate embrace, fell to the ground. She smiled weakly, tears glistening in her eyes as she looked into Izuku's. "Be strong, Izuku." After defying death for those final moments, Inko's body slumped to the ground, lifeless. The green-haired woman closed her eyes forever, leaving her son alone in the dark world, a guilt that would haunt her even in the afterlife. Izuku stared at his mother's lifeless body, cradled in a pool of her own blood. "Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. No reply came. In his mind, he could still hear her warm voice answering his call, but in reality, there was only silence. "Mom," he repeated, tears streaming down his cheeks as he inched closer to her. Gently, Izuku lifted his mother's head and cradled it against his chest. "Mama," he sobbed, his body shaking with grief. "Mama, please don't go." The distant wail of police sirens echoed through the air, a haunting reminder of the chaos outside. Maybe the heroes were on their way, but what did it matter now? His mother was gone. What good were heroes if they couldn't save the ones who needed them most? Why was the world so cruel? Why did his mother have to die? She had been a model citizen, kind and honest. Yet she was the one who paid the ultimate price. The injustice burned within him. If there were gods, why hadn't they saved her? Why did they let this happen? Izuku's mind raced with anger and confusion. Heroes were supposed to protect the innocent, yet a criminal had roamed free, taking his mother's life. The country's justice system had failed. The heroes had failed. If All Might had been there, his mother would still be alive. But Japan was without its symbol of hope, and the other heroes were nothing more than imposters, incapable of keeping the villains at bay. That day, a large part of Izuku's innocence and childish view of the world died with his mother. The death of a loved one can shatter a person's ideologies and harden their heart, especially when that person is a growing child. In another world, Izuku Midoriya would have a living mother who would watch him become the world's #1 hero. In that world, Izuku Midoriya would have a pure and innocent heart, capable of saving even the vilest criminals. But this was not that world. This world was crueler, more unforgiving. A fire had consumed Izuku's childhood, reshaping his dreams. From the ashes of that fire, a demon rose. A demon that would only grow stronger with time. A demon that would either consume the world in darkness or free it from the shadows. That's it for today, guys. Hope you all enjoyed this video. If you do, consider leaving a like, share, and subscribe. And don't forget to check out the author of this story. All details in description. Thanks for watching. Take care.